Disastrous news if you are a refugee. Apparently, more than half of the nation's governors in 27 states saying they oppose letting Syrian refugees into their states. Now, these states that are protesting the admission of refugees, they range from Alabama and Georgia to Texas and Arizona to Michigan, my state, and Illinois. There's also Maine and New Hampshire. Among these 27 states, all but one, can you guess what they all have in common? Republican governors. No, of course. Of course. New Hampshire does not have a Republican governor. Now, the announcements that they're not going to let any of these refugees in came after, of course, authorities revealed that at least one of the suspects, believed to have been involved in the Paris terrorist attacks, entered Europe among the current wave of Syrian refugees. Now, he had a fake passport. He had also falsely identified himself as a Syrian named Ahmed al-Mohammed and was allowed to enter Greece in early October. Now, Republican reaction, of course, comes from the Hill, and it reports that Speaker Paul Ryan had said that on Tuesday that the House is likely to vote this week on legislation that would temporarily halt the resettlement plan to ensure that the vetting process is sufficiently thorough. So he says, look, we're gonna see about stopping these 10,000 Syrian refugees to make sure that we can vet them properly. Well, how can you vet them properly? They come from a war zone. It's not exactly, it's not as if they have databases and things. Yeah, I don't know how you would vet somebody. I'm not sure of the process. So I'm not sure how you can make it so that you can vet them more accurately. But nonetheless, Democratic governors of several states, including Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, have also said that they will accept the refugees. Others, such as Montana Governor Steve Bullock, Missouri Governor Jay Nixon, and Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper, have indicated that they will also continue to take refugees, although they said, look, before we do that, we still want to have more safety precautions. We'll accept them, but we really want to beef up this vetting process. And look, I don't have any problem with that, okay? There's that concern for safety. And there should be. I totally get it. There is that concern for safety. And there's also being an asshole. Now, my example of asshole comes from Chris Christie.
The Syrian refugee policy, what would Chris Christie's policy be vis-a-vis there are hundreds of thousands of Syrians who would love to come to this United States. The president says, let's bring in 10,000. I'm not sure what your policy is. What is it, Chris Christie?
I do not trust this administration to effectively vet the people who are proposed to be coming in order to protect the safety and security of the American people, so I would not permit them in.
What if they were orphans under the age of 5?
You know, Hugh, we could come up with 18 different scenarios. The fact is that we need appropriate vetting, and I don't think orphans under 5 should be admitted into the United States at this point.
So no orphans under the age of 5 should be admitted. What does that have to do with vetting everyone else? They're orphans and they're toddlers. I'm pretty sure a toddler doesn't constitute a terror threat. Terrorist toddlers. I've never heard of it. Besides, how are you going to vet somebody who may or may not be able to tie their own shoe? I'm serious. Chris Christie's an asshole. Yeah, of course you're supposed to let in the children. That's the whole point. You have refugee orphan children, you let them in. It doesn't matter. You let them in. They're kids, they can't fend for themselves. You want to send the orphans back to Syria, back to the rubble, back to the war, back to ISIS. Who's an asshole? Chris Christie. Anyway, look, for those of you who, think that we shouldn't take refugees because ISIS has and could slip someone else in, right? To cause terror in America. I get it, right? You're sort of right. And let me get to that point. ISIS is actually kind of banking on this. Of course they want to do that. And it would be a win for them to do so. Why? Well, because it gets all us Westerners all freaked out. so that we don't take in refugees. It sort of makes it easier for ISIS to go after the moderate Muslims if we send them back to Syria. We send them back in the middle of the war zone, they're easy pickings. That's a win for ISIS, especially if they're moderate Muslims. If we send them back, they've only got a couple of choices. You join ISIS or you die. That's essentially all the choices that I see. That's why they ran. They didn't like those choices. They got the fuck out. And remember, we're talking about women and children here, right? People who can't fight. Women, children, elderly. But apparently, even if you're a child, even if you're an orphan, under the age of 5, Chris Christie won't let you in. It's amazing. By not taking in refugees, we're kind of doing ISIS's work for them. And let me explain. Their whole goal right now is to basically get as many Muslims on their side to fight against the West. They want to unite everyone who is a Muslim to their way of thinking to wage war in the West. It's kind of what they want to do, right? By scaring the rest of us. And they want to do that by scaring the rest of us into thinking that the whole of Islam, the entirety of Islam, should be openly warred against. Well, look, if you go after somebody's core identity, their religion, you're going to band them together. If they're attacking the very core part of you, for example, put yourself in the shoes of another religion, right? If somebody says, we're declaring a war on Christianity, doesn't matter if you're a Methodist, doesn't matter if you're a Baptist, doesn't matter if you're a Christian fundamentalist. If somebody declares war on your very core, your very faith, you're going to get with the people who share your faith and defend yourselves. You're going to defend yourselves. It's exactly what ISIS wants them to do. Except they want to get the 1.6 billion Muslims around the world all on their side by making us be the enemy. And when you don't help the moderate Muslims, when you go against them, you kind of do their work for them. You do the work of ISIS. You split yourself up into their side versus our side. You don't want to do that. You don't want to do that. Besides, ISIS right now, they've got a force of what? 200,000 at best, right? That's compared to about 1.6 billion total Muslims in the entire world. It's kind of a small number. And let's not forget, most Muslims right now, they despise ISIS. They're fighting against them. Countries like Iran, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, which is hilarious, right? Saudi Arabia, because they're almost exactly the same. You could argue that Saudi Arabia is about the same as ISIS. Remember, they behead people all the time. I think they beheaded more than 100 people this year on charges ranging from witchcraft to apostasy. They still stone women for adultery in Saudi Arabia. I find it kind of hilarious that ISIS hates Saudi Arabia, but I don't get it. Maybe it's because they're not extreme enough for ISIS. I don't know. But you also have countries like Turkey, which is the NATO's biggest ally in the Middle East. I'm just saying, there's a lot of Muslim countries that are currently fighting against the Daesh. It doesn't make sense to alienate all Muslims. No, you side with the moderate Muslims to take out the extreme ones, because they're against everyone. The most extreme people are against everyone else. I don't understand. And here's the thing, going back to the refugees, the very people that are caught in the middle of the fighting, all these different countries trying to fight ISIS in Syria, in Iraq. These refugees, these are the people that are pouring out because they have nowhere else to go. Does it make sense that terrorists will take advantage of the refugees coming out of these places to try and inflict terror in the West? Yes, it does make sense. But just because someone bad will take advantage of this situation, it doesn't mean that everyone should stop taking in refugees. Besides, of the refugees taken in by America since 9/11, which numbers about 750,000, you know how many of them have been arrested on domestic terrorist charges? 0. We've taken in 750,000 refugees since 9/11. None of them have been convicted of domestic terrorism. None of them. And yet here we have politicians throwing a fit, screaming bloody murder over 10,000. Over 10,000. But hey, you know what? This isn't the first time America has done this. For some historical perspective, I go to 1938, where we did the same thing, not to Muslim refugees, but to Jewish refugees. And this comes from the Washington Post, who found a poll from 1938. 1938. And in this poll, fewer than 5% of Americans surveyed at the time believed that the United States should raise its immigration quotas or encourage political refugees fleeing the fascist states in Europe, the Nazis, the vast majority of whom were Jewish, to voyage across the Atlantic. 2/3 of the respondents, meanwhile, agreed with the proposition that we should try to keep them out. And in 1939, there was a ship full of Jewish refugees that was turned away from Florida. Turned away. We did it to the Jews. Now we're doing it to the Muslims. We've seen this movie before. We've done this before. Now, if we were to do the same thing today, if there were refugees coming out of Israel, and people were to say, hey, we shouldn't take them, heads would explode. Oh my God, you're anti-Semitic. Well, it's sort of the same situation. Only the players have changed. The refugees have changed. But they're all the same in the fact that they're fleeing violence and death and destruction to come to America to have a better life. So my final thoughts on this is that all the fear-mongering about ISIS slipping in with the refugees, I'm not saying it's not a real threat. It is. But it shouldn't be a justification from keeping people who are more likely just trying to escape the rubble and death and destruction of ISIS and the civil war in Syria and the problems in Iraq out of our country. It's not a justification. We should be welcoming the refugees. We should be welcoming the moderate Muslims. We should be making bridges, building inroads with those people. So when they do go back home, they can go back home. They'll say, no, everything you've heard about America is wrong. They are kind, they are just, they are good people. That's the kind of reputation that we want to have.